Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you tuning in from around the world. Welcome to Career Coffee Chat Live. I'm your host, Erin Urban. And as you tune into the live show or the replay, don't be shy. Say hi, share where you're from. The live stream is available on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. So if you like the Career Coffee Chat Show podcast, which is available on your favorite podcasting platform, give me a rating. Your feedback is important. Also, important is a massive change we're experiencing right now in our workplace and our personal lives. So, I'm looking forward to chatting with you, my friends, about this change, specifically the new leadership skills needed for the evolving workplace. So, my big question for you is hey, what leadership skills do you think are needed now? So, no matter where you're tuning in from, I'd love to hear from you. I want to welcome you to the show. And I also want to hear what you think is different, particularly when it comes to leadership skills. Now, some of these skills are important no matter where you are in the organization. Actually, you don't have to have a title to be a leader, as most of you probably already know. Influential leadership is something everybody can uptake and does actually, in fact. So you, my friend, has a lot more impact than you give yourself credit for, because most of you are leaders in your own right, whether or not you have a title associated with it or not. Also, as you're thinking about that question, what leadership skills do we need now in this quote unquote hashtag future of work? Unless you've been living under a rock for the past 2.5 years, the world has experienced massive shifts. Now, some changes we're experiencing are a direct result of the pandemic, while others have been accelerated due to the pandemic. Others are simply a result of generational change in perspectives, values, and priorities, particularly one of those being what's very hot right now called quiet quitting. Yes, in fact, it's not quitting. And we'll talk about that more as the show evolves today. So today it's just me chatting with you, my friends, about the change we're seeing in the workplace, about the change in our personal and professional lives, and how you, as a leader, no matter where you are in your professional evolution, can thrive and adopt these new skills. So, regardless of the reason, whether it's been thrust upon us because of the pandemic or whether it's generational, the skills we need now and into the future to lead effectively are very, very different. Particularly different than what we've been leaning on historically. So, that which we've leaned on, or the leadership paradigm, the corporate paradigm we've been leaning on in the past, simply will not work moving forward. And today I'll share with you top skills with you, why they matter, and what they look like. Also, we'll do a quick overview of the recreation of the workplace, like why are we seeing this in the first place? The top 5 habits to ditch in order to thrive in the future of work, and most importantly, why quiet quitting isn't such a bad thing after all. I know. Oh my God. So, quick overview about the recreation of the workplace. Why is it that we're seeing this change? Why do we have a great resignation? Why do we have a great reset? What's going on? Are my coworkers crazy? No, they're not necessarily crazy. They're dealing with a result of what we've all been experiencing for the past 2.5, almost 3 years now. So, things are different, and there's a reason why. We can't necessarily thrust an entire humanity, an entire global organism, if you will, into massive, tumultuous change without some sort of impact from that change. So, why are we seeing the recreation of the workplace? Well, one of those is 2020 is what I like to call the great reflection. So, we're seeing the great resignation or great reset right now, while 2020 was a great reflection. It was a time, whether you wanted to or not, that we actually had to pause. Like, we didn't have a choice. We kind of had to pause. And whether we wanted to or not. Now, sometimes that was forced upon us, and sometimes we chose to take a break. But whatever it was, for the first time, we had a moment to collectively take a breath. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, probably most of us, including me, are guilty with kind of what next. We have what next syndrome, like just, constantly going busy, busy, busy. Our to-do lists are massively long. We have all these things going on and we have this churn. And we really do identify, particularly in America, with busyness. Like we like being busy. When someone asks you how you're doing, you're like, oh gosh, I'm so busy. And we kind of feel secretly proud of the fact that we're busy because, I mean, just imagine if, good for heaven forbid, if we were not busy. I mean, that's bad, right? Well, actually, not so much. But that's not what this show is about. What we are talking about is a recreation of the workplace and the fact that we had a moment to pause in 2020 and actually reflect for the first time ever how our lives were going. How well was our career going? Did we actually like it? And a lot of times the answer is no, we don't. Why? Well, because. So I'll give you a little history. So let's back up a little bit. You, me, and a lot of people and similar age groups. I know Generation X. Nobody talks about Generation X. We don't exist. Whatever. But regardless, we went into the workplace. We graduated college. We went into the workplace back when dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. And we got a job. And we just went into the workplace. We didn't go into the workplace going, gosh, this kind of sucks. And I really don't like this structure. It doesn't really work for me. We just went into it because that's what was available. We didn't really have a choice, to be fair. So as you're tuning in, whether you're watching the replay now or tuning in live or watching the replay later, let me know what you think about this. Do you agree? We kind of went into what was available to us, which was corporate structure at the time. Very hierarchical, usually siloed. Now, why is this? Why was it this way? Well, quite frankly, the corporate structure has been predominantly the same and mimics something that has been in existence since before medieval times. That's right. So why are we seeing the recreation of this structure that's been proven through time? Well, it has existed for a long time. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the best structure. Now, there's been a lot of talk about redoing the corporate workplace structure. What would we do? And because I'm a Lean Six Sigma black belt in continuous improvement, I've done a lot of investigation and work along these same lines. Like we should organize in terms of value streams versus silos. Okay, here's the accounting, here's project management, here's sales, throwing things over the fence at each other and usually not very happy with one another. So it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. We've just put up with it and made it work through pain and agony and oftentimes ineffectiveness. So why are we seeing this recreation? Because, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, we actually had a moment to pause and go, this doesn't really work for me. I don't like working, by the way, in this big corporate wheel, 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, 15 hours a day. I don't like doing that. I don't like giving up my weekends, and I don't like my boss calling me after work and expecting that report first thing on his or her desk first thing the next morning. That's not what I want, and that's not how I want to live my life. I don't want to live my life barely ever seeing my family. I don't want to live my life spending most of my time in the workplace, in the office, and barely ever spending time with my kids, for example, during their critical years. There's a whole lot of ahas and epiphanies that came out of this time to reflect. So that is why we're seeing a reinvention of the workplace. For the first time ever, we kind of have options now. We have options. We have technology. We can do remote work. We can do these types of things and still spend time with our family and loved ones and those things that mean the most to us that we've kind of been out of touch, to be honest, for most of our adult lives until we're forced to be in that space. So that's a little bit of the why. Now, are there more aspects? Of course, there's more. These are just a few insights into why we're seeing the Great Reset. One of them being the corporate structure as we know it, quite simply, doesn't work. It hasn't really worked, not effectively or efficiently, ever since the 20th century. But we've put up with it because that's what we knew. And no one was giving us an option until finally the employee feels a little bit more empowered. Now, what that will look like moving forward, your guess is as good as mine. However, my friends, we have the opportunity now to actually make a difference. And with that opportunity becomes the recreation of what leadership looks like as well. Because again, leadership was based on a very old, hierarchical, ancient, medieval model. and has since fortunately evolved quite a bit for people to understand some terms like around servant leadership, which is widely known, typically more in the Christian faith. But actually, servant leadership, if you were to break it down, really is the fact that leaders exist to support their teams. I mean, if you didn't have a team, you wouldn't be a leader, right? So that's really what leadership is. So, what does that look like now that our teams are evolving and our people are evolving and people's needs are changing? And the priorities and values and what is success for younger generations is very, very different than my generation or generations before me that have created this corporate workplace that is currently under quite a bit of stress right now and strain, and people are scratching their heads going, what do we do with this thing? We're not quite sure. So moving forward, the workplace will be different. Why? Is because we've had several key influences, one of them being the pandemic accelerating change, one of those being a new generation predominantly coming into the workplace, another generation coming into position of more decision making and prominence in the workplace, and that's shifting how and what we're doing in the workplace and the values that are driven in the workplace as well, which is driving different leadership skills. Moving forward, these leadership skills will be the quote unquote norm. And if you do not have them, you won't thrive in the future with workplace. So, some of those top 5 habits to ditch in order to thrive in said workplace, well, one of those is directing. Directive leadership. You do this, you do that, we do this, we all do that. No, we don't direct, we collaborate. So, a term you probably already heard is collaborative leadership versus directive leadership. So, that telling people what to do, it doesn't really fly. and it won't in the future of work be that skill that will serve you. So, a more collaborative style of leadership is a path forward. And we'll talk more about what that is and why it matters. Also, mentoring versus coaching. Now, mentoring is great. What's wrong with mentoring? Well, there's nothing wrong with mentoring. And mentoring sometimes gets really close to training and telling. When we move forward into the workplace of the future, which is now, by the way, coaching, the qualities of coaching people into understanding is really, really important versus mentoring or telling them what to do. So, mentoring has typically been historically a more seasoned individual telling a younger person or emerging professional how to do things. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but that really is more like training. What we're not doing is we're not helping that individual understand the why and come to through a creative problem solving process. Yes, it takes a little bit longer, and the results are much more effective. That person retains the knowledge and you don't have to keep telling them. So, also another one, a habit to ditch, is relying on one's IQ or your native intelligence, that emotion, that intelligence quotient that has driven us. What do you mean? Being smart isn't the way forward? Well, I've been trained to do this since elementary school. And we have. We've been trained through getting good grades and being a good little student that IQ is the most important thing. And it's not, actually. I know, it's crazy. EI or EQ, or otherwise known as emotional intelligence, is actually one of the most critical components of anyone seeking success or seeking to thrive, particularly during tumultuous times, or at any time, to be honest with you. There's tons of research out there prior to the pandemic supporting this and understanding why IQ is not necessarily the key in EI or EQ. Emotional intelligence is the key and how important that is. And for leadership, it is a absolute essential element in order to thrive as a leader, in order to be effective as a leader in the workplace of now and to the future. You have to have it. So what is it? Well, emotional intelligence, basically explained, is your ability to identify, understand, and interact in a intentional way with emotions. Sounds very simple. It's people skills. It's knowing how to read the room, it's knowing how to respond, knowing what to say, and most importantly, what not to say, versus just trying to be the expert. Quite frankly, experts are experting a lot and sometimes too much to their own detriment. The other skill to ditch is withholding information. That's right, leaders, those of you in positions of decision making qualities within corporate structures, withholding information is not going to help moving forward because people are crying out, demanding transparency. They need to know, they want to be a part, again, collaboration. They want to be a part of the company moving forward. They want to know the why. They don't just want to produce things because I told you to, directive leadership. So withholding that information within reason is not welcome. And historically, companies and leaders too have done a terrible job of communicating anything within their teams, and particularly communicating effectively. So withholding information, particularly people who are subject matter experts, they think, oh, well, I can have job security if I hold my information and don't share. No, that doesn't really work either. And that just makes you a big bottleneck, and we don't like that. So withholding information doesn't help. Sharing and collaborating does. So ditch the withholding. Typically, that's linked to a scarcity mindset, which is not going to serve you. So let me know if you have any questions about these so far. And if you're tuning into the replay later, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help or share with you any insights that I have. So on to quiet quitting. Now, tune into our next live stream. We'll be talking with someone specifically from the HR organization about quiet quitting and what that is and why we're saying it, and most importantly, what we can do both as an employer and an employee. But I want to talk about why quiet quitting is sometimes mislabeled and why it's not necessarily bad. Now, if I recall correctly, quiet quitting is a term that was authored by someone who was, let's say, a prior generation to me, so someone who is more seasoned in their professional career than I. And this person was referring to employees' lack of, let's just say, energy in the workplace. Like they weren't necessarily going above and beyond. They weren't doing more than what was absolutely required for their job. Now, sometimes, obviously, this can be an issue. If you're just doing the bare minimum to get by, yeah, that's not a great thing. But quiet quitting has encompassed quite a bit more than just doing the bare minimum to say, hey, I work here. So some of you obviously have heard of this term, and why I don't think it's a bad thing is this. Well, let's look at some facts. So fact number one, most Americans during 2020 and the majority of 2021 worked more hours than they had in 2019. So the average amount of hours worked in 2019 and 2020 and 2021, those hours on average were higher in 2020 and 2021. Now, why is that? Well, one of those is because suddenly our work was in our home and we couldn't get away from it. We couldn't hop in the car and go commute for an hour and a half, in traffic, which was not awesome. But we filled up that hour and a half instead of doing healthy things. A lot of us, unfortunately, leaned back into work. One of the reasons why is because, well, in 2020, we had an economic, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Some people got let go. So survivor's guilt kicked in for a lot of people, and they started working more hours because I got to work more hours, got to prove that I'm a good worker. So I'm going to work all these hours. Well, it's not sustainable. You cannot work 12 hours a day for even 5 days a week and expect to continue that. Because right now, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, we have a record number of people who are experiencing burnout. Now, what is burnout? Just in case you're wondering whether you're experiencing burnout, maybe you just missed having a vacation this summer. Burnout is when you can't even become excited about something you love to do. Burnout is when you're struggling to make decisions. You don't know how to prioritize, and you're just mentally exhausted. You don't have the mental energy to address even perhaps some critical situations in front of you. That's burnout. And I know personally because I've experienced it twice in my professional career. Yay, me. What do you do with burnout? You have to heal. And the only way to do that is to unplug. absolutely unplug. No, you can't just work less hours. Maybe that will help a little bit. However, you really do, in order to heal quickly and effectively, need to unplug completely. And that's one reason why I'm an advocate of longer vacations, or at the minimum, taking more frequent breaks more often, because it allows you to decompress. And if you take more frequent breaks more often, that allows you not to get compressed in the first place. So we have a record number of people experiencing burnout right now because they work so much more. I think one of the stats I saw was like 30% more than normal in hours put in the workplace, on the computer, tapping away, you know, on Zoom meetings. Oh, hey, by the way, Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and that adds to the mental drain that Americans specifically have experienced. Now, outside of just doing the bare minimum to get by because you don't want to be there, that may be legitimately quiet quitting. You don't want to be there. You're doing bare minimum to get by and just say, yes, I work here. Okay, yes, but by and large, what we're stamping quiet quitting on here is people who are just burned out. And what they're doing is they're resetting expectation levels because, quite frankly, their bosses, their supervisors, the company have got a little spoiled because they're putting in all these hours for the last year and a half, almost 2 years, and now they're throttling back to something that's more sustainable because you just can't sustain that kind of pace. You just can't. So let's have some perspective around quiet quitting, particularly from a leadership perspective. If you see someone who is throttling back, hey, do this thing called having a conversation. It's a good idea. And that's something we'll be talking more about later when it comes to these top leadership skills we'll be exploring. So let me know, pop in the chat, send me a comment, what have you, if you have thoughts about this. Because what do you think about quiet quitting? I want to hear from your perspective, because we definitely want to address that in a future live stream. I want to know what you think. Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, let's now talk about those top new leadership skills. So some of them you've heard of, like collaborative leadership. Some of you may not have heard of so much is like leader as coach. And what does that look like? Well, none of these would be possible if we didn't first talk about the more critically obvious leadership skills that go into both of these terms that you may or may not have heard of them. A big one. What's is interesting about this one, it's most obvious, yet it's also often the most overlooked skill. And without it, none of the other key skills are possible. In this skill, it's called self-awareness. Sounds really simple, huh? Well, self-awareness is really interesting because a lot of people think they have it and they don't. I thought I had it. I thought I was self-aware. No, we're really not. So self-awareness is not something necessarily that you just do on your own. You actually do need some outside perspective, and that's one reason why I'm a proponent of a 360-degree feedback reviews. When you are the one who decides you want them, not just because someone else decides you need them, but when you decide you want them because you want that feedback. Because it's very difficult to put your brain in someone else's brain and go, okay, how do you see me? Self-awareness is also being open to receiving that feedback and understanding how am I perceived. Because until we get that feedback, we're just out here in kind of a vacuum. We're just doing the same behaviors and habits that may or may not serve us. So self-awareness first is getting some legitimate data, if you will, to understand, okay, what am I perceived as? Is it the person I want to be perceived as? And if not, what are some small adjustments that I can make to help shift that perception in the direction that I would prefer? That's authentic to me, right? Because we don't want to be someone we're not. So if you're a reserved person, please don't try to be the most wildly extroverted person. That won't serve you. That'll be massively draining and you'll be miserable and you experience a thing called burnout. But self-awareness is extremely important and it is the author of literally everything else. Without self-awareness, you cannot grow. So becoming more self-aware, becoming more aware of self, your drivers, your passions, your purpose, what gives you energy, what drains you. What's my zone of genius? Any of you have heard or seen me before? You know I'm talking about zone of genius quite a bit. So what is that thing? And how can I be more aware of it? What are my triggers? What triggers me to perhaps respond in a way that I don't necessarily prefer? What are things that trigger me to be more happy and more calm? So that is self-awareness, getting a really rich, in-depth knowledge of self, going down to what is my work style? What is my communication style? Whenever I'm coaching with someone, for example, we always start with who are you? What is your communication style, your listening style? What is your work style? How do you collaborate with others or don't? Right? These are the fundamentals that a lot of people just lost right over. They're like, oh, well, if I just put in more effort, I'll get rewarded. That's not the way it works. Because you can put in more effort all day long, but if you're self-aware and also exhibiting behaviors that are abrasive, you're not going to get promoted. That was me. Wrote a book about it. Check it out. It's on Amazon. Trust me on this. Just doing more hard work, trying to be the best, trying to be a perfectionist, only makes you miserable and unhappy. Take it from someone who knows, who's been there. It's not fun. However, becoming more self-aware was massively rewarding. It's not a terrible thing at all. Some people are like, ooh, I don't want to know. That way I don't have to address it. Well, that's not really going to help you. Because here's the other thing. While you drive your credibility through your behaviors and actions, you don't determine it. Other people do. Because we're a society, and you get promoted and you get opportunities and you move forward in the future work and you lead teams better because of how they think of you, not the other way around. And it does start with self-awareness. And that is the key to all of the other skills. Make sense? So let me know if that makes sense to you. And let me know if you've heard of any of these little things, such as collaborative leadership and leader as coach. Now, while you may have heard of some of these aspects and some of the new skills that go into them, like EI or EQ that I've talked about before, empathy and authenticity, it's equally likely you felt super uncomfortable with at least one of them, right? Great to see you, Hussein, tuning in. He says, I think one of the most important things we need is the skill of discovering those who have leadership qualities, such as initiative and taking responsibility. Then they're gradually refined. That's right. Absolutely. So if you don't have the initiative and you don't have responsibility, Hussein, it's highly unlikely that you'll seek self-awareness. So it's really one of those things, can't put the chicken before the egg, right? Or the egg before the chicken. So one has to come first. Which one is it, the chicken or the egg? But in this case, self-awareness doesn't happen unless you do have the initiative. Right? Because someone lacking initiative would probably respond more like, ooh, I don't want to know because that way I don't have to deal with it. And actually, I had that response from a friend of mine the other day. Ooh, I don't want to know anything about that because that way I won't have to deal with it. And it was a health related issue. I was like, okay, so you're going to be happy with dealing with the outcome of what you're experiencing right now, I guess. I don't know. So let's talk about and explore how what is emotional intelligence, empathy, authenticity. We talked about self-awareness quite a bit. And one of those I mentioned is, of course, 360 reviews. Why is that becoming more self-aware? Because it gives you other people's perspective. And while, how can I put this? We operate most of the time, 90% of the time, we operate on automatic. Okay, our responses, our behaviors are very habitual. And that makes sense. I mean, when you think of it really from a neuroscience perspective, your brain has to have these automatic behaviors because if it didn't, then you would be learning everything all over again every day or having to intentionally make a decision for every little micro action. And there's a lot of them. That could be very draining. That takes a lot of energy. So in order to conserve energy, the brain makes habits. You don't even think about them. And we're there. most of the time. We're in this habitual cycle. So becoming more self-aware, particularly about how you perceive for others, helps you identify, hey, what behaviors actually matter? Maybe you think it's this thing over here, but in reality it's that thing over there. Because sometimes we identify with our bad habits, like, oh yeah, I know, I should listen more. And you don't really take it seriously, but other people are like, oh my God, I don't want to talk to her because she never listens and she's always talking about herself. But you think it's something else. That's really what you should be working on. And it's really the other thing that you're taking for granted. Gloria mentions, I think it's resilience is a key skill needed for the ever-changing terrain and space we live in today. Yes, and Gloria, I'm glad you mentioned that because the key to resilience is self-awareness. That's why I talk about self-awareness being fundamental. It's literally incredibly fundamental to everything else. And without it, you can't be resilient, because resilience, oftentimes, I'm glad you brought that up, Gloria, because oftentimes it's confused with grit. So we've all heard about true grit and pushing through and just getting it done. That's not resilience at all. In fact, resilience is the ability to take care of self so you can respond more positively in situations. And actually, research has found that people who identify with having true grit are less resilient. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because people who are addicted to the grit, I've got grit. We're going to have grit. We're going to push through this stuff. Well, they're pushing through and they're kind of have tunnel vision, kind of blinders on, and they're just pushing through and they're getting it done. They're gritting their teeth and they're just, have determination, and they're going to push through. Well, they're not really taking a moment to pause and reflect that if the actions they're taking are really valuable, is that even the goal you want to achieve anymore? Are you, taking care of yourself in a way that you can respond positively to situations and be more agile? Because if there's a word that's linked with resilience, it's agility right now too, because we have a very uncertain terrain, as you mentioned, Gloria, a very uncertain terrain in the workplace, in our personal lives. I was speaking with somebody the other day. They're like, it's almost impossible to plan anything anymore. We just don't know what's going to happen. It's like, throw it up in the air and just, I don't know, we'll pick that one. Right. Because we have become a little comfortable with having this finite plan. And what we have found over the last 2.5 years, I'd love to hear from you, whether you're tuning in now or later, that having that finite plan may not necessarily be realistically feasible, because there is a lot of unknowns. So amen to the resilience. And for those of you who are thinking of resilience as true grit, which I'm not saying that's you, Gloria, at all, for those of you who are connecting those two, I'd like you to just kind of separate them, because they're not the same thing. And resilience has nothing necessarily to do with just pushing through and not having that perspective, not having, popping up the head every now and then, having a pause and taking care of self is really important. Those people who have that true, they're addicted to that true grit factor, they don't necessarily take care of themselves at all, ever. So, and we see that historically in the workplace and in our professional lives as well. We see true grit being rewarded historically. Like that's been the label of those people who are successful. They've got grit. That's not necessarily going to serve people very well moving into the future, right now and into the future, because resilience, the ability to be agile, be adaptive to the moments that we experience, is the most important. Take, for example, something simple. Earlier today, I was to have a call before this live stream. Well, my calendar just decided to not notify me and not have it on the calendar, even though I put it on the calendar. So I get an email. Hey, I'm on. I'm like, oh, I'm that person who let somebody sit in Zoom, purgatory. That's like the horrible. I mean, how could it possibly be that person? Of course, there's a lot of negative self-talk that I had to squash. So I get on there trying to find it, and I was like, where did it go? So I had to go to my Zoom. So I had to be agile, right? I had to go to Zoom and actually find it in my schedule and then connect. And then, of course, that person couldn't get their camera to work. We have to be agile and adaptable in the moment and just have the EI, EQ, and empathy to say, hey, look, don't worry about the camera. I'll leave my camera on, It's just one of those days. And we went forward and had a great conversation. But we had to be agile and adaptable in the moment because things don't always go to plan, right? So let's talk about a few of these other skills and let me know if any of them pop up to you, or if a new skill isn't popping up to you, maybe an old habit that you see leaders have quite a bit or has been adopted in the past quite frequently. If there's something maybe that they should ditch, actually let me know about that. So if there's a habit leaders have or an old leadership paradigm that you don't really think is going to serve us in the future of work starting effectively now, let me know. Pop it in the chat or send me a comment later if you're watching the replay. So we talked about self-awareness. We talked a little bit about EI and EQ and what it technically means. And by the way, increasing your emotional intelligence or your emotional intelligence quota is something that can be learned. It's not an inherent trait, just like leadership. It's not charisma. Don't confuse leadership with charisma. In fact, it's really fascinating. Some research has been done about the link about charisma and leadership effectivity. And actually, most effective leaderships don't necessarily have charismatic personalities. They actually are a little bit more reserved. So for those of you who think, oh, I could never excel in a leadership position because I'm more reserved, not true. In fact, you can be a much more effective leader if you are a reserved person versus someone who is addicted to being in the limelight and having everybody look at you and being charismatic. Not necessarily a good leadership quality. So that's a leadership trait that can be ditched, because those people who are thinking more about themselves in a charismatic state, they're not necessarily invested in other people, which is the core of leadership. It's not necessarily about you. Now, I'm not talking about sacrificing yourself to the point where you're, injuring yourself, personally or profession. I'm talking about, in service to others in a healthy and balanced way. And Hussein mentioned very rightly, the successful leader is to bring out the best in his or her teammates. So absolutely, that's their purpose, is to support them at the highest level and not necessarily seek glorification for oneself. It was really interesting for those people who might be struggling with that, is the more you lift other people up, the more they'll lift you up. It is a very beautiful process. So let's talk about what else, leadership traits and characteristics. What does it look like? How does that evolve into the future of work, and why? Well, self-awareness we've already been through. And one of the reasons I talk about that and emphasize it so much is because that is the foundation by which everything else comes from. Because if that's not there, you really can't grow necessarily. So EI, EQ, we've talked about that a little bit. And how that comes across, it's oftentimes linked to empathy. Now, empathy is an outgrowth of a healthy, balanced emotional intelligence or emotional intelligence quota. But empathy is not necessarily the same thing. It's just an aspect of it, if that makes sense. So empathy is that ability to not necessarily put one's own judgment and bias on other people. Yes, that's a judgment and bias thing. So absolutely, one of the new key leadership skills is the ability of non-judgment. So that also comes very closely linked to what I mentioned before, is leader as coach. So leader as coach is someone who has very aware of unconscious bias. So they are managing their biases. They're also come from a more non-judgmental standpoint. And they are not a person who is going to be an advisory individual. So you go to this person and expecting them to tell you what to do, and that's not how this interaction will go. This person will, through reflective questioning, encourage you to come up with the idea and then offer some guidance, again, in a collaborative style. So leader as coach is becoming more popularized and more well understood. But in order to do that, this person has to have a good degree of empathy. And empathy is the ability to be aware of one's biases and how they come into play, and also be more in a space of non-judgment. And then also not be in a space of self-serving, so interested in the other person. So that person is curious and interested in the other person. Now, it's very interesting how we think empathy or we're empathizing with someone has historically occurred. And until I did more research, I was guilty of doing the same thing. So somebody comes to you with a problem, you go, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I experienced blah, 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 a couple weeks ago. That's not empathizing. That's relating, but it's not empathizing. It's not showing empathy. That's actually very selfish. It's putting yourself in their story, not what you want to do. So with a healthy empathy, you would listen to that person. You might say, gosh, I can imagine that's very stressful for you. How is that impacting you in your work life? And so you're encouraging that person to share and talk. And you're not offering advice unless asked. If you want to offer advice, it's at request. So in a leader's coach, which is using empathy heavily, one would then say, I would certainly offer some advice if you would like. Would you like to know my experience? Or you can tell a story. That's oftentimes what I'll do in my coaching relationships. I'll tell a story. You say, well, I have a story that you might be able to get some interest from. Would you like if I shared that story? And with their permission, I will share the story. I won't put that person in the story. That's up to that person to put themselves in the story. That makes sense. So that is empathy, not necessarily, there's a difference between empathy and relating. So hopefully that makes sense to those of you tuning in and now and later. And if you have any questions about that, like how's empathy, like how can I show? I think I'm showing empathy, but maybe I'm not. I heard you talk about, putting yourself in the story. Oops, maybe I wasn't being empathetic. But it's natural for us to do that. It's natural for us to want to relate because it's a huge, important part of our human connections is relating to other people. So oftentimes we'll lean on relating first versus just shutting up and listen to the other person talk versus putting ourselves in the story, because oftentimes we put ourselves in that story. So hopefully that makes sense. Muhammad says one of the most difficult moments as a leader are those when you are determined to make a critical, painful, but right decision. Very good. So that's another leadership skill that's been around for a while. I wouldn't say necessarily is new, but it is important and it is often overlooked when you have to make a difficult decision. Actually, I wrote a whole article about, the art of doing that as a leader, art of making difficult decisions as a leader. And it can be a very painful process, particularly if you identify with someone who has a higher level of empathy. So you're, say, an empath, someone who really does, feel other people's emotions more readily. This can be very difficult for you. So just understanding the why I'm making this decision because of a good reason, and making sure that as a leader, you have that difficult balance to make. You need to put the company first, and this individual is not supporting that path, then there needs to be some adjustments made. So those can be very difficult decisions for leaders. And it does come sometimes at a cost, depending on whether an emotional cost, depending on, your personal work style as an individual. So while that's not a new leadership skill, that is definitely a leadership skill that's needed moving forward. And what we're finding is, depending on the individual, we're finding people less inclined to put themselves in those difficult positions. And they'll do things like ghosting or sending bad news via text. No, not good. So when you do need to have that difficult conversation, it has to be in person. It has to be. That's not something you can do via text. At the minimum, have the decency to do it, via Zoom or some other, video conferencing software, so they can see your face, so they can interact with you, and be open to answering that person's questions. Again, bringing that empathy to the fore in a non-judgmental way and being more balanced. And by the way, when you lean into that, that helps you as a leader be more calm and confident and clear in what needs to be said. Right? So let's lean into another one that's heard a little bit, which oftentimes make people really uncomfortable. It's a new leadership skill. And I say it's new because it hasn't necessarily been something we've seen or heard a lot of in the past. So authenticity or vulnerability. Some people say you got to be vulnerable. And I like to call it this. You're being a human. You're being a person to other people. What I see, it's very, very interesting, and it is a psychological nuance, if you will, when we get into a structured relationship with someone within an organization. And a relationship could be a work relationship, like a team to a leader, etc. We tend to shift our perspective and expectations of that individual to not necessarily take into account that they're a person and a human being. Fascinating. It happens all the time. So we're totally shocked and appalled that this person in this leadership position made the next decision or did a certain thing when we forget that they're a human being, just like you are. So we tend to do this. There's a term in America called putting them on a pedestal, but we're shifting our perspective to have this unrealistic, perhaps, expectation of this person's behavior. So authenticity, easy for me to say today, our vulnerability is really that ability to bring yourself, your whole self into the professional picture. Now, why is this new? Well, historically, and certainly when I was becoming an emerging professional, you did not bring your personal life to work. That was a no-no. That you kept your personal life separate, and you closed the door on your personal life when you came to work. Now we all know now that's absolutely impossible, particularly when you're working inside your home. Irregardless, I think the pandemic, not that it did good things, but one of the things that it did was it highlighted the fact that we are all people. So that helped make the transition away from this old paradigm where you had this line between your personal and your work life. You bring your whole self to work every day, even if you think you're shutting the door on it, you're not. And donning a face, a mask, or a different persona to go to work may or may not be healthy. Now, to be fair, we all have different personas, if you will, or different situational behaviors. That's natural. But creating a forced behavior for a certain environment, that may not be very healthy. I know I did it because I thought that's what you should do, because you shouldn't mix personal and professional. That just wasn't what you did. So I went into the workplace with this myth, acting very highly in my consciousness, and it really hurt me in my professional career and actually inhibited my ability to achieve a leadership position until I got over it, became self-aware, and grew past it and recognized I could bring my whole self and be more authentic and share who I really was and be a person at work. Now, that doesn't mean you drag all your dirty laundry into work every day and talk about how, you did something that may not be, let's just say, ethical or maybe not in keeping with how you want to be perceived. I wouldn't say that would be a good thing to share in the workplace. And sharing something about, I don't know, your dogs, your pets, your kids, your vacations, just being a person, hobbies. Oh yeah, I like to paint, or I really enjoy working on old cars. Having a part of you that goes beyond the box of your profession is healthy and expected now. Why? Because, well, one, quite frankly, people are a little fed up with the whole wall thing between personal and professional. They are. They're done with it. Particularly people who are more extroverted. Over it. Another is because of technology, and technology is great. And when you are seeing someone, let's just say in this little box, like you're seeing me right now, if you're watching this live or the replay, well, I could be acting like anybody, right? I could act like anybody. I could put on a wig and I could be blonde. I mean, you could be anything. So because of that potential of fakeness, that is one reason why authenticity, being a little vulnerable, appropriately vulnerable, is extremely important. Now, is that super comfortable for everybody? No, it's not. It's not necessarily natural for everybody to go talking about their personal life in a Zoom session or a meeting, whether it be in person, virtual, or otherwise. It's just not something that people are used to doing, particularly if you identify with a certain generation. Now, you can learn to do it. You can learn to get over it. I know I had to get past it and become more vulnerable and personal and share more about my life and what I experienced and lessons learned and recognize that actually sharing my quote unquote failures was tremendously helpful to other people. That was a huge wake up aha for me. I didn't recognize that. So, as a leader, thinking you have to come in as this inauthentic, perfect person is not going to work. That's something of the dinosaur age. Just let that go. Let that be a fossil. Don't even think that's going to work because it won't. And people, one, aren't stupid and they can figure out that you're being inauthentic pretty quickly. And two, it's much more freeing and relaxing to be yourself within reason. You have a drinking problem, maybe you don't want to share that, but be yourself within reason in the workplace, right? It's much more freeing. And I was much happier when I felt that I could be who I really am in the workplace. Now, Hussein mentioned, he said, some leaders in family business face troubles due to differences of opinion. I have news for you, Hussein. Some leaders in businesses of any type face difficulties when there's differences of opinion. What would you advise us to do in such cases? Well, if you're experiencing differences of opinion, in such cases, one is to understand what is the root cause behind that difference of opinion. So, leaning into that empathy part of it, the EIEQ and the empathy part of it, coming forward with a non judgmental curiosity. Oh, really? Well, why is that? Do you feel that we should do this way? I'm really curious to know. Just being non judgmental and curious. And when you're in that space, that person will be more likely to open up. Now, if you've already shared, well, I really think and I'm convinced and we need to believe, and you beat the drum really hard on this other opinion, it may be a little bit more difficult to be openly curious and this person to actually share with you. So you may have to be a little bit more transparent and saying, okay, I recognize that I beat the drum on this over here and that my opinion, I would like to set that aside and really understand, your perspective. And just communicating with people in an open and honest, transparent way is absolutely critical when it comes to effective leadership. So many people don't do this, whether they're in leadership positions or not. In general, holistically as a society, we must become more comfortable with this method of communications. Open, transparent, candid, sharing where we are emotionally, our thoughts. We need to become more comfortable with this for multiple reasons. I read some research from someone, I guess about a couple months ago, that talked about one of the keys to thriving in very uncertain times and stress as is open and honest communication. That's extremely important. And what's really interesting for society that is has so many methods of communication, we're terrible at it. So that's number one. Really understanding from a non-judgmental and curious, openly curious way their perspective, and listen to them. Really listen to them. Don't try to figure out what you're going to say next. Don't try to come up with an answer or a smart solution. Just really listen to them and pass the pause. Everybody will pause. And typically, that first pause is them formulating more thoughts. But oftentimes, we'll hop in with something we want to say or feel like we should say because we abhor a vacuum or silence. Allow the silence. And if they don't come up with something in a reasonable amount of time, just say, is there more? And if they say, no, that's really about it. Um, then start, seeing where you can make commonalities happen, right? Or, this is very interesting too. Oftentimes, people with two very differing opinions are actually quite the same methodologies or processes or maybe outcomes, just different ways to get there, right? So oftentimes there are similarities. So see where those similarities are and where you can meet in the middle to be more of a collaborative approach. Now, sometimes there's just no mending the bridges, right? So you've totally different perspectives. There's just no commonalities. And in those cases, what I recommend, and this is not used very often because we're seeing this so often, particularly with political views in America, is that you're a Democrat and you're a Republican and neither one of you are going to talk to one another. I've seen good friendships just be disintegrated because of this, which is, when you think about it, it's a little crazy because the person is still a person. And I've heard a lot of justifications for these actions, but in reality, when you cannot see the person as their opinion, but see them as a person, that's when you know you've evolved in leadership. And it is a skill, and it does take time perhaps to develop, but that's a true, important, and absolutely critical essence to leadership effectively now and into the future of work. So hopefully that helps you, Hussein, as one, to try to find commonalities from an open and non-judgmental way first. And then if that doesn't work, at least see the person for the person and not for their perspective or opinion, if that makes sense. There are some instances where the leader needs to see the person, not the action. And in Leader as Coach, we talk about, coaching the person, not the situation. So we're really focusing on the person part of this and not the trappings or the temporal or temporary situations that are revolving around that person. So hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully me sharing some of these new skills for leaders in the now and effectively into the future of work will help. Some of those we referred to today are Leader as Coach and collaborative leadership. Probably most of you have heard collaborative leadership. But what it isn't, before I sign off today, is collaborative leadership is not about you not having an opinion and being a doormat. That's not collaborative leadership. Collaborative leadership is not you letting everybody do whatever they want. That's not collaborative leadership. And Leader as Coach is not you giving everybody advice. That's not coaching. So it's important for people to know these distinctions, because collaborative leadership is a leader who facilitates a collaborative and in the sharing experience of knowledge, and then is a person who can synthesize that knowledge in a productive way while guiding the entire group to uplift the skills of every individual. Will every individual be at the same level? No. And it's your leader, it's your job as a leader to help uplift those in very different degrees, right? So that is the leadership of the future, among other things. And Leader as Coach is not about giving advice. It's not about going to everybody going, you know what you really need to do is just this. Yeah, since when did that go over? Never. So Hussein mentioned, do you think leaders should support diversity and inclusion? Yes, of course, they should support diversity and inclusion. And in a few minutes, we're going to support the train that's going to go through our lovely town of Fayetteville, Texas. So you're going to hear that in a moment. But diversity and inclusion is absolutely important and critical, non-negotiable. How can I say something that should be a foundation of who we are? I was talking to someone earlier today, in fact, and I said, I'm looking forward to the day where we don't have to call out diversity and inclusion as a separate thing. That is just who we are. There's a train. So, diversity and inclusion is absolutely important. Where people get off the bus is because we really like to see opinions and we like to interact with people who agree with us. So I was reading something last week. This was really, really good information. And I wanted to share with you today, actually. So thank you, Hussein, for that prompt. So diversity and inclusion, and I'll bring this back up. Hussein said, do you think leaders should include or support diversity and inclusion? Yes. So one of the ways to do this is to encourage your own neuroplasticity. Now, what is that? That's our brain's ability to accept new ways of being, form new ideas. It's a beautiful thing, and it's incredibly important for healthy brain function and for innovation. Because if you don't have diverse ideas and you don't have diversity of people and cultures, then it's likely you will just keep doing more of the same, right? So if you like innovation, if you want to stay on the cutting edge, if you want to make sure that you don't miss any intellectual capital that your team is carrying around inside of them, then you want to support diversity and inclusion. Now, diversity and inclusion comes in multiple different ways. It's not just how you look, it's not just the culture you come from, and it's not just how you identify yourself. All these are important, absolutely. I'm also a little different in saying I think the more you overemphasize it, the more it becomes difficult for the brain to accept. So when you just think of diversity and inclusion as a way of being that's non-negotiable and, well, that's just the way you are, then it becomes less of a thing, if that makes sense. I'm really looking forward to the day we don't have to have these kinds of conversations because we just naturally are diverse and inclusive, right? I guess I struggle a little bit with it because I grew up in a family that was very inclusive and loved diversity. So I just really don't understand why we struggle, but we do. So there we go. Anyway, people have biases. And so here's a good one. This is one that's oftentimes very unconscious. So, did you know that if I spoke with an English accent, that I would be instantly given more IQ points than if I spoke like this? That's right. That is a great example of diversity and inclusion unconscious bias. So those are the sneaky ones. So we pretty much have the obvious ones for the most part, unless you're a diehard bigot. You pretty much have the obvious ones. Okay. But the sneaky ones are the ones where are you judging someone by how they speak or don't? Are you judging someone because they have tattoos? Are you judging someone because of their jewelry choices? Are you judging someone because they didn't, oh my gosh, wear a suit and tie to work today? I'm looking forward to a future of work. By the way, it is coming, so you may as well get used to it, where it doesn't really matter how you dress within reason. That we can let go of the trappings of professionalism and understand as the person that is the value, not how you look or what you identify with. So for leaders, in order to be effective and leverage empathy and leverage EI and EQ, yes, diversity and inclusion is non-negotiable. And that's probably why I didn't necessarily highlight it first, is because of my firm conviction that it's not necessarily something you can separate. It's inherent to the leadership component as a whole being. So I know we've gone a little bit over our time today. So hopefully that was valuable to you, my friends, tuning in, whether you're watching live, whether you're watching the replay. Again, thank you for all of you that did tune in and comment today, Hussein and Gloria. Great to see both of you. And I'd love to have any comments that you have or questions. Feel free to reach out to me or just comment here on the live stream. There is a replay available on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So you're welcome to check out any of those. And of course, there is my YouTube channel. So if you want to be notified of any of these live streams or check out any of the replays and the podcast at your leisure, feel free to hop over to my YouTube channel, which is available in the comments on LinkedIn. And I'll give you the link here momentarily. That is, of course, at youtube.com/C/Coach E Urban. So all you have to do is search Coach E Urban and I'll pop up and you'll get that. And you can subscribe if you'd like, and you'll be notified of any of the live streams coming. My friends, it's been such a pleasure to spend time with you today. And we'll be back next week, of course, with more insights into the future of work and how you can thrive and elevate your impact. And until next time, keep elevating. Bye for now.